June 25, 1956, Connor Avenue, Detroit, Michigan. A car came off the assembly line and nobody celebrated. Not because the workers didn't care, because this was the last one. A Packard Patrician, four-door sedan, the final automobile to carry a name that had meant something specific to American buyers for more than half a century. The name had meant precision. It had meant luxury that didn't apologize for itself. It had meant that the man who owned one had arrived somewhere, and that the car in his driveway was evidence of that. After this car, the name would live for 2 more years on rebadged Studebakers built in Indiana. But everyone in the industry understood what this particular day was. Not a transition, an ending. The factory that had built Packards for 50 years was on East Grand Boulevard, and it had already been shuttered for months by the time that last Patrician rolled down Connor Avenue. The Grand Boulevard plant, 80 buildings across 80 acres, the complex that Albert Kahn had designed, and that had once employed 40,000 workers, sat quiet, its machinery being crated and shipped elsewhere, its copper wiring going with it, its future entirely uncertain. What happened to that building over the next 7 decades is a story separate from the story of the car. It is, in some ways, a more interesting story. The car died of decisions. The building absorbed those decisions and kept standing long after the people who made them were gone. This is the history of the Packard Motor Car Company and the factory on East Grand Boulevard. One of them is a cautionary tale about what happens when a company stops believing in the thing it built. The other is a story about what buildings remember when everyone else has moved on. Before we get into it, drop in the comments where you're watching from. Stories like this one reach people in places Packard cars never sold, and I always want to know who's here. If you're new, subscribe. We cover histories like this one every week. Now, to understand what happened to that factory, you have to go back 57 years before that last car rolled off the line. You have to go back to a man named James Ward Packard and to a conversation that went badly. James Ward Packard was born in Warren, Ohio, on November 5, 1863, the son of a businessman who believed that useful things should work exactly as designed. The first time, every time, that belief transferred to his son completely. As an undergraduate at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, Packard wired his own dormitory room door with a switching mechanism that would open it remotely. Not as a school project, not for a grade, just because the problem interested him, and he had the skill to solve it. He ran telegraph lines to friends' rooms on other floors. These were not pranks, they were proofs of concept. He graduated from Lehigh's mechanical engineering program in 1884 and went to work at Sawyerman Electric Company in New York, where he helped develop incandescent lighting systems. When Westinghouse purchased Sawyerman, Packard returned to Warren and founded the Packard Electric Company in 1890 with his brother William Doud Packard. They manufactured incandescent carbon arc lamps and transformer equipment. James filed patents consistently and relentlessly over the course of his life, more than 40 in total, because he understood that an idea with no mechanism for protecting it was just a gift to whoever got there second. Packard Electric would ultimately survive both the car company and Jamesy. Ward Packard himself, continuing to operate as an automotive components manufacturer well into the 21st century under successive owners. The electrical company outlasted the automobile company by decades. That fact is not discussed much. The watches tell you something important about who he was. Over the decades, James Ward Packard commissioned timepieces from the finest watchmakers in the world. Patek Philippe, Vacheron et Constantin, requesting complications of extraordinary technical difficulty, perpetual calendars, celestial maps, minute repeaters. He didn't collect watches the way wealthy men collect paintings, as trophies displayed to demonstrate taste. He collected them because a watch is a mechanism, and a mechanism either works perfectly or it doesn't. And perfection in a mechanism is one of the few things in the world that is completely honest. His 1927 astronomical pocket watch, Grand Boulevard, capable of displaying the time of sunrise in Warren, Ohio, sold at auction decades after his death for $1,800,000. That number tells you about the watch's quality. The commission tells you about his character. On July 22, 1898, James Ward Packard paid $1,000 for a Winton motor carriage. He recorded the transaction in his diary with characteristic precision. Tried Winton motor carriage. Fine price $1,000. Immediate delivery. The car was made by Alexander Winton, a Scottish-born bicycle manufacturer turned automobile builder who was then one of the most commercially successful car producers in America. The Winton was a catastrophe. Packard drove it. It broke down. He brought it back for repairs. He made suggestions. He returned with more suggestions. He had opinions about the design, the materials, the tolerances. Winton had no patience for it. The confrontation, recorded in various accounts with slight variations, ended when Winton told Packard, "Well, if you're so smart, maybe you can build a better machine yourself." Packard replied, "Why, Mr. Winton, I guess I'll do just that." He wasn't bluffing. Within months, James Ward Packard had assembled a small team at the Packard Electric Plant in Warren, and on November 6, 1899, 14 months after the Winton diary entry, the first Packard automobile completed its road test on the streets of Warren. Locals watched. The local paper covered it. The car worked. What followed was a company built entirely around one man's conviction that a machine that required apology was not worth building. Packard's engineers tested exhaustively before producing. They rejected substandard materials from suppliers without negotiation, which alienated multiple vendors who had never had a customer refuse their components before. The cars started at $2,600 at a time when competitors were selling vehicles for between $375 and $1,500. This was not a pricing error. It was a statement about what Packard refused to compete with. The slogan emerged the same way the company did, not as a marketing strategy, but as an accurate description of reality. When orders began, arriving faster than promotional materials could be printed, a businessman in Pennsylvania called the company requesting a brochure before placing an order. Packard told him they didn't have one ready yet. The man asked how he was supposed to know if the car was worth buying. Packard told him, "Just ask the man who owns one." He meant it literally. The people who had already bought Packards were, at that moment, the most persuasive sales force the company had. The slogan caught because it was true. Advertising and marketing and slogan are the wrong words for what "ask the man who owns one" was at its origin. A slogan is something you construct. This was something James Ward Packard said because he had run out of brochures and believed that was an honest answer. The advertising industry would take it over later. Young and Rubicam managed the campaign from 1932 through 1951. And it would become one of the most recognized automotive slogans in American history. At its beginning, it was just a man who was confident he had built something worth recommending. James Ward Packard had built exactly what he set out to build. That, as it turned out, was the moment the decision started being made by other people. Henry Bourne Joy was not an engineer. He was something more useful to an engineer's ambition and more dangerous to an engineer's control. A financier who understood exactly what he was looking at. Joy was born into Detroit's railroad aristocracy. His father, James Frederick Joy, was president of the Michigan Central Railroad and had been a confidant of Abraham Lincoln, involved in the backroom conversations of the Republican Party through much of the Civil War era. Henry Joy grew up understanding how institutions were built and how money moved through them. He married into the Newberry family, one of Detroit's oldest fortunes. His brother-in-law, Truman Handy Newberry, would eventually serve as United States Senator from Michigan. When Joy saw something he wanted to invest in, he had both the capital and the connections to move quickly. In January of 1901, Joy was in New York City with Newberry. They were on the street when a fire alarm went off. Two Packard automobiles gave chase to the horse-drawn fire wagon, kept pace with it, passed it, arrived at the fire ahead of the horses. Joy walked to the nearest Packard dealer, asked for one, and was told the only available car was the floor model. He bought it. He drove it to Detroit. By the time he arrived, he had decided what he wanted to do next. Joy traveled to Warren, met with James Ward Packard, and heard what the company needed to grow. Packard was building fine cars in a modest facility with limited capital. Joy assembled an investor group that included Newbury and Russell A. Alger Jr., son of a former governor, senator, and secretary of war. On October 2, 1902, the Ohio Automobile Company became the Packard Motor Car Company, with Joy's group holding majority ownership and Joy himself positioned to run the operation. The dynamic that emerged immediately was this. James Ward Packard had founded a company to build the car he believed in. Henry B. Joy had acquired a company he planned to turn into an institution. Both men loved the Packard automobile. They loved it for different reasons. Packard loved it for what it was. Joy loved it for what it could become. In July of 1903, James Ward Packard submitted his resignation. He agreed to rescind it only when Joy insisted. The founder of the company was already being managed. In January of 1903, Joy purchased 66 4/10 acres on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit for $19,434. The price, even in 1903 dollars, was remarkably modest. Joy had commissioned a young architect to design a factory complex appropriate to Packard's ambitions. And the first 9 buildings went up with extraordinary speed. The move from Warren to Detroit was complete by October of that year. The Detroit Free Press called the new complex one of the most modern and best-arranged factory plants in Detroit. That characterization was accurate for about 2 years. Joy had watched those first 9 buildings go up and understood, well before they were finished, that he hadn't gotten what he had in mind. They were conventional mill-style structures, wooden columns, cramped floor plans, dim windows. The kind of factory that every manufacturer in America was building, because no one had yet built anything better. They worked. They were adequate. Joy had not purchased a 66-acre site on East Grand Boulevard to be adequate. He went back to the architect and told him to try something that had not been tried before. To understand what that architect did next, you have to understand where Albert Kahn had come from. Albert Kahn had arrived in Detroit from Germany at the age of 11 with no money, no connections, and a color blindness that had already ended his first ambition. He had shown musical ability as a small child in the Rhine Valley and was considered a candidate for serious piano training before the family emigrated. In Detroit, the family was poor. Piano lessons were not an option. Drawing was. Kahn had a talent for drafting that his eye condition didn't interfere with. Color blindness affects the perception of hue, not line or proportion. And at the age of 15, he presented himself at the Detroit architectural firm of Mason and Rice and asked for work. He had no credentials, no previous employment, and no money to support himself while he learned. He asked them to let him work without pay until he had proven his usefulness. George Mason, one of the partners, agreed. Mason taught Kahn drafting. Kahn taught himself the rest. In 1890, the firm awarded him a traveling scholarship to Europe, where he spent a year studying construction methods and architectural traditions, with, among others, Henry Bacon, who would later design the Lincoln Memorial. Kahn returned to Detroit, became chief designer at Mason and Rice at 22, and founded his own firm, Albert Kahn Associates, in 1895. By the time Joy commissioned him for the Packard buildings in 1903, Kahn was 34 years old, experienced, and entirely unsatisfied with what he was producing. Every factory he had built so far was a variation on the same limited vocabulary. His brother Julius was an engineer who had spent years experimenting with reinforced concrete. The problem with most concrete construction was in the reinforcement. Standard steel rods and bar embedded in concrete worked, but the load distribution was inefficient, and the connections between columns, beams, and floors were structurally compromised. Julius Kahn developed and patented a new system in 1901 through the Trussed Concrete Steel Company, known as Truscon, that used a flanged reinforcement bar with a calculated pattern of diagonal struts. The Kahn system allowed concrete structures to carry loads in ways that conventional reinforcement couldn't match. What it meant in practice was that you could build a building without the internal wooden columns that had been limiting factory floor plans for a century. You could open the space. For Building 10 at the Packard plant, completed in 1905, Albert Kahn applied his brother's system to every structural element simultaneously. Floors, ceilings, and columns all reinforced concrete, all interconnected through the Kahn system. The bay dimensions were 32 feet by 64 feet. The interior columns that had previously divided factory floors into cramped bays were gone. In their place, open spans, unobstructed from wall to wall, with floor-to-ceiling windows admitting more light than any factory floor had ever had. Workers who had spent their careers in the wood-column dimness of conventional mills walked into Building 10 and found themselves in a room that felt, by comparison, almost like being outside. This was the first industrial building in the world to use reinforced concrete for floors, ceilings, and columns together. The consequences were not slow to arrive. Joy immediately understood what he had. Other manufacturers visited and understood what they were seeing. Within a few years, Henry Ford hired Albert Kahn to design his new facility at Highland Park. Ford's Highland Park plant opened in 1909, built on the structural vocabulary Kahn had developed at Packard. In 1913, inside that building, Ford introduced the moving assembly line. The Model T became affordable. The American automobile industry became what it became. None of that sequencing is incidental. Building 10 at the Packard plant made Ford's assembly line architecturally possible. The commissions came in faster than Kahn could process them. Ford retained him for over 30 years and built more than 1,000 structures through his firm. Chrysler retained him for 20 years. He designed more than 150 General Motors manufacturing plants. By 1937, Albert Kahn Associates designed 19% of all architect-designed industrial factories in the United States. Between 1929 and 1932, the Soviet government hired Kahn's firm under a $130 million contract to design 521 factories as part of the first five-year plan, and to train 4,000 Soviet engineers in American industrial construction methods. The building concept that Kahn had first tested in Building 10 at the Packard plant in 1905 spread within 30 years to Stalingrad. Kahn himself, in the decades that followed, became one of the most important architects in American history. A man who also designed the Fisher Building in Detroit, served on the Detroit Arts Commission, founded the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts, and designed private homes for some of the city's wealthiest families, including several Packard executives. He died on December 8, 1942, at the age of 73. Having designed more significant structures than almost any architect of his era, while being largely absent from the histories written about American architecture, because those histories, for most of the 20th century, were not about factories. Factory and architect are words that don't carry the cultural weight they should together. The work Albert Kahn did between 1905 and his death shaped a larger fraction of the American industrial landscape of the 20th century than almost any other single person's work. He designed the buildings where the tanks and aircraft and vehicles of World War II were manufactured. He designed the buildings where the automobiles that built the American middle class were assembled. His name is not in the standard survey courses on architecture. His buildings don't appear in the textbooks that cover American design history. They are factories. History has consistently treated factories as production sites rather than design spaces, as if the buildings that shape daily life for tens of millions of Americans were somehow less worthy of attention than the buildings that held art. Kahn knew better. He designed his factories for the people who worked in them as much as for the companies that commissioned them. Building 10 at Packard was the proof of concept. Everything that followed was the argument it made. By 1910, the Packard plant on East Grand Boulevard had grown to more than 80 buildings across 80 acres. It had its own power plant, its own foundry, its own hospital, its own fire department. Workers had organized a brass band and a baseball team. The administration building on Grand Boulevard, with its carved stone letters reading Packard above the entrance, was designed by Kahn to look precisely like what it was: the headquarters of something built to last. The men who worked inside it had begun to understand that they weren't just making cars. They were making the future, and everyone could see it. What came out of that factory was not merely transportation, it was an argument. Packard's engineers in the first decade of the 20th century were building cars that cost $2,600 in a market where competitors were selling for a fraction of that, and the reason buyers paid the difference was that the cars were, without meaningful qualification, better. In 1904, Packard's racing car, the Gray Wolf, became the first American automobile to exceed 60 miles per hour. This was not a publicity exercise. It was a demonstration of the engineering that sat beneath every production Packard: the tolerances, the materials, the refusal to accept a component that merely met the standard when a better one could be sourced. Jesse Vincent became Packard's chief engineer and drove the company's technical ambitions for decades. In 1913, under Vincent's direction, Packard introduced the first production six-cylinder automobile engine built in the United States. In 1916, he went further. The Twin Six, a production V12 producing 60 horsepower, the most powerful automobile engine available in America at the time. No other American manufacturer was close. The Twin Six was adopted by the United States military for marine and aviation applications. It established something that would matter enormously in the next war. Packard was not just an automobile company, it was an engineering institution. Alvin Macaulay became company president in 1916 and led the organization for more than 2 decades. Under Macaulay, Packard's cultural position hardened into something close to official status. In 1921, Warren G. Harding became the first United States president to ride to his inauguration in an automobile. The car was a Packard. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, not as a piece of trivia, but as a precise measurement of where the brand stood. The federal government, in choosing the vehicle appropriate to carry the leader of the free world to the ceremony of his assumption of office, chose Packard. By 1929, the Japanese imperial family owned 10 Packards. European royalty ordered them. The Soviet government, which publicly despised the capitalist economy that produced luxury automobiles, privately requested Packards through diplomatic channels. "Ask the man who owns one" was by this point less a slogan than a reasonable instruction. The men who owned Packards included heads of state, military generals, and industrial titans. Of course you should ask them. They were exactly the kind of witnesses whose testimony meant something. At the factory on East Grand Boulevard, 40,000 workers were employed at peak production. The plant ran at capacity. Gross income in 1929 reached $25 million, the equivalent of roughly $460 million in current terms. But the numbers were not what was most notable about the place. When the final model of the 1907 line finished assembly ahead of schedule, workers decorated the last car with flags and drove it through the streets of Detroit. When an experimental 1908 model returned from road testing, workers from across the factory left their stations and gathered to hear how it had performed and to offer their own observations. This was not a labor practice management had instituted. It was what the people who built Packards believed they were part of. A factory culture and a craft culture are not the same thing. A factory culture runs production. A craft culture owns it. At its peak, the Packard plant was not simply an economic institution. It was a point of civic pride in a city that understood industrial production as the measure of a place's seriousness. The complex employed more workers than many cities of the era had residents. It paid wages that allowed those workers to buy houses, send children to school, and participate in the consumer economy that the automobiles they built were helping to create. The 40,000 people who worked on East Grand Boulevard were not merely employees of a luxury car company. They were members of something, a place that had its own rhythms and rituals and customs, that had earned its own kind of loyalty. That loyalty would make the eventual closure harder than a simple factory shutdown. It would make it a bereavement. James Ward Packard died on March 20th. Sion 1928, at the age of 64, in Cleveland, the city where he had once walked into Alexander Winton's factory with a notebook full of complaints and left with a conviction that changed American automotive history. The brand he had founded was, at that moment, the most admired automobile name in the world. He left it at its highest point. He never saw the Depression. He never saw the Studebaker merger or the last car or the ruin on East Grand Boulevard. What he saw in the final years of his life was the factory humming at full capacity, building cars that carried presidents and kings, earning income that exceeded the wildest projections of the 1902 investors who had bet on him. That may have been the greatest luxury Packard ever produced. The Depression arrived in 1929 and immediately posed a question that Packard had never had to answer before. What happens to a luxury brand when the people who can afford luxury stop buying it? The answer in 1930 was, you sell 28,386 cars. That was down sharply from the peaks of the late 1920s, and in the boardroom at East Grand Boulevard, management looked at those numbers and made a decision that was, in isolation, defensible. They would introduce a less expensive model, the Packard 120, priced at approximately $1,200, to reach buyers who couldn't afford the senior line. The 120 appeared in 1935 and immediately set all-time sales records for the company. Packard had solved its revenue problem. What it had created in solving it was harder to quantify. The 120 looked similar to the senior Packard. Wealthy buyers who had paid a premium for exclusivity, who had bought a car that said something unambiguous about their position, now drove something that a middle-class buyer could also own. The premium model and the affordable model shared a visual vocabulary. The men who had previously answered, quote, 3 were now being asked, yes, but which one? The exclusivity that justified the price differential was leaking quietly and consistently with every 120 that sold. This was the first crack in the foundation, not a fracture. The building was still standing, the cars were still selling, the name still carried weight, but the crack was there, and it would widen. Before it did, something happened that gave Packard a temporary and genuine claim to greatness that had nothing to do with luxury automobiles. In 1940, the British government needed Rolls-Royce Merlin Feed 12 engines. The Merlin was the power plant inside the Supermarine Spitfire, the Hawker Hurricane, and the Avro Lancaster, the aircraft on which the outcome of the air war over Europe depended. British production capacity was insufficient for the scale of what was coming. The British government approached Henry Ford first. Ford agreed to produce the engines, then reversed course, stating that he would manufacture only for American defense, not for the British. The reason for Ford's reversal has been debated by historians for 80 years. What is not debated is that after Ford declined, the British went to Packard. The logic was transparent. Packard automobiles had been called the Rolls-Royce of America for 20 years. If you needed an American manufacturer that understood what Rolls-Royce standards meant, you asked the company that had spent 2 decades being compared to Rolls-Royce. In September of 1940, Packard signed a contract worth $130 million, the equivalent of nearly $3 billion in current terms, to produce Merlin engines for the Allied Air Forces. It was the largest manufacturing contract in Packard's history. What followed was an engineering accomplishment that the automotive industry has never fully absorbed into its own mythology. Packard engineers spent nearly a year redrawing every Merlin blueprint from British to American drafting standards, converting specifications, tightening tolerances, and solving the manufacturing challenges created by the differences between British and American precision instrument production. A Rolls-Royce engineer who visited the Packard plant during the process noted that the company had made instant dismissal the penalty for any worker found with a hammer or file in their toolbox, tools that would be used to force parts into alignment rather than manufacturing them to the tolerances required. In August of 1941, the first Packard-built Merlin engine ran. It was designated the V-1650. It performed. Over the course of the war, the factory on East Grand Boulevard produced 55,523 Merlin engines, more than a third of total worldwide Allied production. 9,000 women were employed at the plant to build them. Eleanor Roosevelt visited the factory and personally commended the workers. Bernice Palmer, a Packard production worker, appeared on the cover of Life magazine in 1943 for her contributions to the war effort, and received a commendation from the War Production Board in Washington. General James Doolittle Hadichasiwa, who had led the Tokyo raid, walked the Packard factory floor and inspected the engines that would fly in the aircraft his pilots would command. Beyond the Merlin itself, Packard metallurgists developed a silver lead alloy with indium plating for crankshaft bearings. that gave Allied engines a durability advantage over their German counterparts. German engineers who captured and examined the bearings studied them without being able to identify the indium plating. They concluded it was an impurity in the alloy, a defect, not a feature. It was the reason the engines lasted. The Germans were looking directly at a manufacturing advantage they couldn't read. The indium bearing detail is worth dwelling on because it captures something true about what Packard was at its best. The improvement wasn't visible. It didn't show up in specifications or press releases or sales material. It was in the metallurgy, in the tolerances, in the decision to develop a solution that was difficult to reverse engineer because it was genuinely superior rather than merely different. James Ward Packard, who spent his life commissioning pocket watches of extraordinary complication and insisting that every part meet the standard before it left the plant, would have recognized exactly what his engineers had done. That approach to manufacturing, that particular stubbornness about the quality of what couldn't be seen, was the thing the brand had been built on. For 4 years during the war, it was saving lives at altitude over occupied Europe. The war ended in 1945. The Merlin contract ended with it. The question was whether an organization that had just demonstrated the highest level of precision manufacturing in American industrial history could translate that capacity back into the luxury automobile market and reclaim what the 120 strategy had quietly surrendered. The answer was more complicated than anyone at Packard was prepared for. The problem was not immediately visible. In the first years after the war, pent-up demand for consumer goods produced strong sales across the American automobile industry. Packard sold cars. The factory ran. But underneath the post-war numbers, something structural had shifted in the market, and General Motors had understood it first. In 1949, Cadillac introduced a modern overhead valve V8 engine. It was lighter and more powerful than anything Cadillac had been producing. And it established the technical benchmark for American luxury automobiles for the decade that followed. Packard's engineering department recognized the challenge immediately. Their answer to it, a genuinely competitive V8, would not reach production until 1955. 6 years. 6 years is a long time in an industry where technical leadership is the primary argument for a premium price. During those 6 years, Cadillac's overhead valve V8 was the engine that automotive journalists wrote about, that wealthy buyers drove, that the market understood as the current standard. Packard had built the engines that won the war, and then allowed Cadillac to build the engine that won the peace. The buyers who might have chosen Packard chose Cadillac instead, and the damage to brand perception when accumulated with each passing model year. The 120 problem had never been resolved. It had merely been paused by the war. When production returned to peacetime automobiles, Packard's lineup still contained models at different price points that shared too much visual language. The wealthy buyer standing on a showroom floor in 1948 or 49 could not look at a Packard and understand immediately, without asking whether it was the expensive Packard or the affordable one. That ambiguity was fatal to a brand whose entire value proposition was unambiguous distinction. Cadillac had no equivalent confusion in its lineup. When you bought a Cadillac, everyone who saw it understood what you had bought. Packard could no longer say the same thing. James Nance became Packard's president in 1952 with a clear-eyed diagnosis of this problem and a plan to address it. He wanted to reverse the damage by separating the Clipper, the lower-priced model, from the Packard brand entirely, giving it a standalone identity so that the senior Packard could recover its unambiguous positioning. He was building toward 1957 as the year the reset would complete. New tooling, the competitive V8 finally in production. A lineup that could not be confused with anything affordable. It was a credible plan. It required capital and time. Nance intended to generate both through military contracts. Packard was earning cash through jet engine development work for the Air Force's B-47 bomber program. Those contracts were administered through the Department of Defense. The Secretary of Defense in the Eisenhower administration was Charles Wilson. Before his appointment as Secretary of Defense, Charles Wilson had spent his career at General Motors and had served as the corporation's chairman. Wilson's office canceled Packard's military contracts. The historical record on Wilson's motivations is circumstantial. not documented. What is in the record? Wilson had led the corporation whose luxury division competed directly against Packard for the same buyers. Wilson's office terminated the contracts that were funding Packard's ability to retool for the 1957 reset. The consequences for Packard's capital position were severe enough to make Nance's recovery plan unfinanceable. The Cadillac division of General Motors continued to operate without interruption under a Secretary of Defense who had built his career there. Here's the question that stays with the history. Was this a deliberate decision made by a government official to destroy a private company in order to benefit his former employer? Or was it a routine contract cancellation that happened to fall with devastating precision on a company that could not absorb it? The record does not answer definitively. The timing does not suggest coincidence. What happened next is what happens when a company running out of time and capital surveys its remaining options and finds none of them good. The American independent automobile manufacturers had been consolidating throughout the early 1950s. Nash and Hudson had merged to form American Motors. The remaining unattached companies were Studebaker, which had been losing money for years and had a factory in South Bend, Indiana, that was structurally inefficient and contractually expensive to operate, and Packard. The merger argument was straightforward. Combined, they would be the fourth largest automobile company in America, with enough scale to compete with the Big Three and enough Packard engineering credibility to restore buyer confidence in both brands. One industry veteran described the merger as two drunks helping each other across the road. The characterization was accurate. What Packard discovered after the merger was completed on October 1, 1954, was that Studebaker's financial condition was considerably worse than the acquisition due diligence had revealed. The South Bend factory had high labor costs locked into a contract that could not be meaningfully renegotiated. The plant itself was aging and inefficient. The debt load was heavier than disclosed. The company Packard had acquired to save itself was, from the day of closing, an accelerant on the fire. The merger was announced as a triumph. Nobody who understood either company believed it. The consequences arrived on a schedule that allowed no time for recovery. The 1955 Packards, the first to feature the long-awaited V8, received positive initial reviews. Then the reliability problems emerged. The transmission and electrical systems had been rushed into production before they were fully developed, and the resulting quality issues in the field were exactly the kind of thing that James Ward Packard, with his 40 patents and his instant dismissal policy for substandard tolerances, would not have permitted at any stage of the process. Dealers reported problems. Buyers reported problems. The brand that had built its entire identity on the proposition that you could ask the man who owned one was now producing cars whose owners had things to say that the marketing department would have preferred they not. There is a particular cruelty to that timing. Packard had spent 6 years behind Cadillac on the V8 question. When the V8 finally arrived, it had been built under capital constraints that made proper development impossible. The company had waited 6 years for the answer, and the answer had quality problems. Every repair ticket from a 1955 Packard transmission was, in the market's silent accounting, another transfer of a potential buyer to the Cadillac showroom down the street. In the spring of 1956, Studebaker-Packard closed the factory on East Grand Boulevard. Production was consolidated at the smaller Connor Avenue plant. The 80-acre complex that had taken Albert Kahn less than 3 years to build, the complex that had employed 40,000 people, that had produced 55,000 Merlin engines, that had been declared one of the most modern industrial facilities in America in 1903, and had spent the following half-century demonstrating that assessment was conservative, was shut down and stripped. Machinery was crated for transfer. Copper wiring was pulled from the walls. The administration building on Grand Boulevard with the word Packard carved above the entrance was rented to the Detroit Ordnance District of the United States Army. June 25, 1956, Connor Avenue, the last patrician. We were there in the opening of this story, and now we know what the ending meant to the people present for it. 2 more years of Packard badges on Studebaker bodies followed. The 1957 and 58 Packards were built in South Bend, Indiana, with fiberglass noses and plastic fins and Studebaker chassis underneath, and they sold 2,622 units in their final year. For reference, Checker Motors, a company whose primary product was taxicabs for commercial fleets, outsold the final Packards. In 1962, Studebaker-Packard dropped the Packard name entirely from its corporate identity and reverted to Studebaker Corporation. In 1966, Studebaker ceased all automobile production. The last chapter of the Packard story was written in a factory in South Bend that had nothing to do with James Ward Packard or Albert Kahn, or the 66 acres on East Grand Boulevard where it had all started. There was one person left to turn the lights off. John Leo McDevitt was 65 years old and had worked for the Packard Motor Car Company for 33 years when a reporter from the Detroit News came to find him in April of 1958. He was the last hourly employee remaining on the payroll. He had watched every other worker leave before him, one by one, over the months since the plant closure, until the complex was his alone to look after. His job in those final months was maintenance, keeping the building secure, overseeing the crating and shipping of whatever equipment remained, making sure the facility was locked. When the news reporter arrived, machines were still being wrapped in preparation for transfer to other facilities. The floor of what had once been the most productive luxury automobile plant in the world was occupied by the machinery of its own dismantling. McDevitt drove a Packard. He parked it in the space the vice president of the company used to use. His final job, when everything had been transferred and the last machine had gone, was to cut the power off. He did. The factory that Albert Kahn had designed in 90 days in 1903 had been emptied of everything that had made it a factory. What it was left with was the structure itself, the reinforced concrete of Building 10, and the buildings that followed it, the bones of something Kahn had built to endure because he had not known how to build anything less permanent. The building would stand. Nobody had figured out what to do with it. What happened to the factory on East Grand Boulevard after Packard left is not a story with a single, clear antagonist. It is a story about what happens to something massive and historically significant when it passes through the hands of people who don't have enough money or enough time or enough of both to do what needs to be done with it. In the years immediately following the plant closure, the building demonstrated something that the people who had abandoned it might not have expected. Edward Land and Irving Norrie, who acquired portions of the property, began leasing space to industrial and commercial tenants. By 1960, more than 39 companies were operating inside the Packard complex, employing approximately 4,000 workers. An electrical equipment manufacturer, a department store's distribution operation, a toy company, an industrial heating firm. The building that Kahn had constructed to carry the loads of automobile manufacturing had more than enough structural capacity to house a dozen smaller businesses simultaneously. The facility worked. The concrete was sound. The bones held. For more than 2 decades, the Motor City Industrial Park, as the complex was rebranded, functioned as exactly what it sounded like. Through the 1960s and 70s, tenants came and went, and the building absorbed the changes without complaint. At peak occupancy in the later years of that era, 87 companies operated inside the old Packard plant. It was not glamorous, it was functional. Albert Kahn had built it to be functional, and functional it remained. The deterioration was slow, then faster. The scale of deferred maintenance that accumulated in a complex of 80 buildings across 80 acres exceeded what any single owner could reasonably address without substantial capital. In 1987, Bioresource Inc., led by developer Aziz Konker, purchased the property and continued the industrial park operation. Tenants were still leasing space, but the gap between what the building needed and what its revenues could support was growing. Some tenants were dumping chemical waste on the property. Environmental violations accumulated. The city of Detroit foreclosed on portions for non-payment of taxes in 1993 and again in 1997. Konker's company filed for bankruptcy. In 1999, the city formally closed the Motor City Industrial Park. The commercial tenants left. The building did not. What moved into the vacant space next was not what Henry B. Joy had envisioned when he commissioned the administration building with the Tuscan columns and the carved granite entrance. Detroit's electronic music scene had been developing since the early 1980s. an American art form that originated specifically in this city and spread to Europe, where it had by the 1990s achieved the status of a genuine cultural movement. The scene needed spaces that were large, acoustically interesting, free of the commercial logic that governed licensed venues, and available in the middle of the night. The Packard plant, 7 stories of empty reinforced concrete on East Grand Boulevard, was all of those things. The parties that happened inside the building during the late 1990s were not vandalism in the way that word is typically used. They were events. Richie Hawtin, the Windsor-born DJ whose Plastic Man recordings were among the most influential in electronic music at the time, held his Spastik party inside the Packard plant. Approximately 500 people attended. Lights and turntables turned crumbling concrete into a functioning dance floor in a space that the authorized world could no longer figure out what to do with. The people who gathered there were not unaware of the building's history. Part of what made it what it was, atmospheric, charged, specific to Detroit, was that it had been the greatest factory in the greatest industrial city in America. And now it was this. In 2010, a Banksy mural was discovered on one of the plant's walls. International media covered the story. The world's most anonymous and most recognized graffiti artist had, at some point, walked through the Packard plant and decided it was a canvas. The building had become art before anyone involved in the official discussions about its future was ready to call it that. Meanwhile, in the parts of the building that neither the ravers nor the graffiti artists were occupying, the systematic stripping continued. Scrappers, working without authorization, operating at industrial efficiency, removed every accessible piece of copper wiring, every recoverable piece of structural steel, every window frame that could be taken without bringing the ceiling down. The scale of this was not casual vandalism. It was organized salvage, running on schedules, using equipment, treating the building as a mine rather than a structure. What the scrappers left behind was a building that retained its bones and lost most of its skin. The reinforced concrete that Julius and Albert Kahn had designed in 1905 held. The copper wiring and aluminum and steel that had been added over 50 years of production went elsewhere. Dead bodies were found inside over the years. On Christmas Eve of 2013, urban explorers discovered a young man who had been murdered and left frozen inside the plant. The building had become, simultaneously, a cultural landmark, a graffiti museum, an internationally famous destination for photographers documenting Detroit's decline, and one of the most dangerous structures in a city that had many dangerous structures to choose from. The ruin photography phenomenon deserves a moment's attention here, because it is part of what the building became and what made the eventual demolition politically complicated. Underscore. Quote underscore 6. Underscore was the term critics applied to the genre, a dismissive label for the practice of photographing abandoned American industrial and civic structures in ways that aestheticize their decay. The Packard plant was the most photographed subject in that genre by a substantial margin. Photographers from Germany, Japan, France, and the United Kingdom paid for guided tours of the interior. Coffee table books featured it. Architecture schools assigned it as a case study. The building was more famous as a ruin than it had ever been as a factory. That fame was uncomfortable for Detroit's civic leadership, which understandably preferred that the city's most internationally recognized landmark not be 116,000 square feet of broken concrete on East Grand Boulevard. But it was also, in its way, honest. The ruin was telling the truth about what had happened, to the company, to the industry, to the city, in a language that didn't require explanation in any language. In September of 2013, Wayne County put 43 parcels of the Packard plant up for tax auction. The winning bid was $405,000. $405,000 for 3.5 million square feet of building on 40 acres in the middle of Detroit. The factory that Albert Kahn had designed, where 55,000 Merlin engines had been built, where Richie Hawtin had played and Banksy had painted, and John Leo McDevitt had cut the power off. The man who placed that bid was a Peruvian developer named Fernando Palazuelo. He had a vision. Detroit had heard that before. Palazuelo's vision was, in fairness, genuinely ambitious. He announced a $350 million master plan, to transform the Packard plant over 15 years into a mixed-use development of shops, restaurants, event spaces, apartments, art galleries, a brewery, a go-kart course, and what he described as a, quote, 7 within the city of Detroit. His company, Artie Express Detroit, established a local office. He hired security guards and began clearing debris. He gave tours of the property to journalists and city officials who wanted to believe the building's rehabilitation was finally at hand. He presented architectural renderings. He spoke in specific terms about specific timelines. In 2017, he held a groundbreaking ceremony at the site. Wayne County Executive Warren Evans stood at the podium and said, "Miracles do happen." The faith behind that statement was not unreasonable. The Packard plant had become, by 2017, the most photographed symbol of American industrial decline in the world. International documentary filmmakers came to Detroit specifically to film it. European and Japanese tourists paid for guided tours of its interior. Academic papers in urban planning, economic geography, and preservation studies cited it routinely. Congressional testimony on the state of American manufacturing had invoked it. There was a genre of photography. Ruin porn, its critics called it, though the photographers who practiced it often disputed the condescension embedded in that term. And the Packard plant was its cathedral. The building was famous. The building had been famous for being a ruin for long enough that its rescue was, by the time Palazuelo arrived, a story that a great many people wanted told. Warren Evans wanted to tell it. The press wanted to report it. Detroit wanted to believe it. What happened instead was the opposite of a miracle, accomplished slowly. Palazuelo's financing, reportedly $80 million in Peruvian private equity, did not materialize on the schedule his plans required. The renovation work that had begun in the first years after the purchase did not continue at the rate the plans demanded. Cleared areas filled with new debris. The security guards were eventually gone. The pandemic arrived in 2020 and provided a convenient explanation for delays that had begun well before it. By October of 2020, Palazuelo had abandoned the mixed-use development concept entirely and was marketing the site as industrial warehouse space, a use indistinguishable from the Motor City Industrial Park the city had shuttered 20 years earlier. The building was not improving under his ownership. It was getting worse. In 2019, the pedestrian bridge that had connected the two halves of the plant across East Grand Boulevard, a visual signature of the complex for decades. The bridge that appeared in virtually every photograph and documentary about the Packard plant ever made, collapsed during a period of Palazuelo's ownership when maintenance work had stopped. Nobody was hurt. The symbolism was not subtle. The thing that connected the building to itself had come apart. By 2021, unpaid taxes and code violations had accumulated to the point where the city of Detroit filed suit to have the property declared a public nuisance. In April of 2022, Wayne County Circuit Court Judge Brian Sullivan ordered immediate demolition of all structures. Palazuelo did not appear in court for the proceedings. He did not meet the court's deadlines. He did not contact the court with an explanation for his absence. Wayne County foreclosed on 33 of his parcels for $784,000 in unpaid taxes, nearly double what he had paid for the entire property 9 years earlier. Detroit City Attorney Charles Ramey stated publicly that Palazuelo had never delivered on anything and had left a horrible, blighted, dangerous property in the middle of the city for years. Here is the arithmetic of the Palazuelo era. He purchased the property for $405,000. He reportedly lost $80 million in private equity. The city ultimately spent $26 million in federal funds demolishing what he abandoned. Nobody made money. Nothing was restored. The building that entered his ownership as a famous ruin exited it as a dangerous one, and the cost of the difference was charged to taxpayers. The city took the building back the only way it had left, piece by piece, with a wrecking crew and $26 million in American Rescue Plan Act funds. Money appropriated by the federal government to help American communities recover from a pandemic, now deployed to remove what was left of a factory that had helped win a world war. There is an irony in that sequence that nobody involved paused to name directly. The demolition took 2 years and 3 separate phases. which is approximately how long it takes to dismantle something that was built to last a century. Emergency work began in September of 2022 at a structure on Concord Avenue deemed at risk of collapse and threatening neighboring residents. This was not a preservation decision. It was a safety decision made under court order in response to a crisis that had been building for decades. The Adamo Group led the major demolition phases that followed. Phase after phase, building after building, the 80-acre complex came down. On March 4, 2024, Mayor Mike Duggan held a press conference on the site to announce the third demolition phase. He called the Packard plant a source of national embarrassment. He said that for 68 years the ruins of the building had been a weight around the neck of Detroit's recovery. The framing was politically useful and historically compressed. The building had not been abandoned since 1956. The Motor City Industrial Park had employed 4,000 workers inside it as late as 1960, and commercial tenants had occupied parts of it through the 1990s. And the rave community had held events inside it through the decade that followed. The ruin that Duggan described was real. The 68 years of it was not. The story the mayor was telling erased several decades of complicated, unglamorous, partially functional life inside the building, including the years when it housed the music culture that would, in the redevelopment plan announced the following December, be honored with its own museum. There is a version of this story in which the building was always a ruin waiting to happen. That version is easier to tell. It is not the accurate one. By December of 2024, 45 of the 47 buildings on the site had been demolished. What remained was what Albert Kahn had built in 1905 and what nobody, through all the years of stripping and neglect and court orders, had been willing to knock completely down. The administration building at 1580 East Grand Boulevard, 112,000 square feet. The legacy Kahn building at 1539 East Grand Boulevard, 116,000 square feet, the oldest structures, the first ones. The buildings that had been there since before Henry Ford built his assembly line, since before the Merlin engines flew, since before John Leo McDevitt cut the power off. Still standing. There is something important in the fact that these particular buildings survived when the others did not. The Kahn system reinforcement bars, the calculated bay dimensions, the structural logic Julius Kahn had patented, and Albert Kahn had first deployed at full scale right here. They held. The conventional mill-style buildings around them came down in phases. Building 10 and what grew around it persisted. A colorblind immigrant's proof of concept, tested in 1905, refused demolition in 2024. The thing built to last, lasted. On December 1st, 2025, the city of Detroit signed a letter of intent with two local developers and announced what they were calling Packard Park. The developers were Mark Bennett, who had completed 6 mixed-use developments in Detroit since 2014, and Orrin Goldenberg, who had co-developed Dreamtroit, the $30 million redevelopment of the original Lincoln Motor Company factory on East Jefferson. Together they formed Packard Development Partners. The plan covered 28 acres of the southern site, a new 393,000 square foot Class A industrial building, expected to support 300 permanent manufacturing jobs, and the restoration of the 117,000 square foot Albert Kahn Legacy building into something that the Motor City Industrial Park era and the Palazuelo era had never been. Something designed for what the building had already become, rather than for what someone imagined it should be. The restored Kahn building will contain 42 affordable housing units. It will contain Detroit's first indoor skate park, and it will contain the Museum of Detroit Electronic Music, MODEM, a dedicated institution for the documentation and preservation of the music culture that emerged from this city and became one of the most influential musical movements of the 20th century. The people who kept the building alive in the 1990s, who carried in generators and turntables and sound systems and 500 people on a Saturday night and made something out of a building the authorized world had given up on, will be memorialized in the building they kept alive. The unauthorized occupants are being acknowledged in the official plan. That is a more complicated and honest accounting of the building's history than it usually gets. Albert Kahn Associates Incorporated, the firm that Albert Kahn founded in 1895, still operating 130 years later with no interruption in its corporate identity, is participating in the redevelopment. The firm that designed Building 10 will restore what's left of it. The chain of custody from the original idea to the current project is unbroken. Expected completion, 2029. If you've made it this far and want to see more history like this, subscribe and drop in the comments what surprised you most. This one had more layers than most. Here is what the Packard story is not. It is not the Oldsmobile story. General Motors killed Oldsmobile deliberately, from the inside after decades of quiet undermining, in a boardroom decision that the workers and dealers who had built the brand deserved better than. Packard killed itself through decisions made by people who understood what they were doing, who could see the logic of each choice individually, and who either didn't see or chose not to see what those choices added up to together. The 120 strategy made financial sense in the Depression. The Studebaker merger made competitive sense on paper. Charles Wilson's contract cancellations may have had a completely legitimate rationale that had nothing to do with protecting Cadillac. Each decision existed in a context that made it defensible. The pattern only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see all of them at once, when you see what James Ward Packard saw when he looked at a Winton motor carriage and understood immediately that the whole thing was wrong. The factory survived the brand because the factory was built by someone who didn't approach his work the way the brand's later stewards approached theirs. Albert Kahn wasn't optimizing for short-term outcomes. He wasn't managing a brand or protecting a margin or calculating a payback period. He was solving a structural problem because it was there to be solved. Using his brother's patent and his own drafting table, and a willingness to try something that had no precedent and no guarantee. The building that resulted from that approach outlasted the company that commissioned it by 7 decades. It outlasted a dozen owners and 2 bankruptcies and 40 years of deferred maintenance and the systematic removal of every recoverable piece of metal from its walls. Albert Kahn built it to be functional. It was still functional enough to house 39 businesses in 1960, 30 years after Packard had begun its decline. The concrete held. The thing built to endure, endured. Precision and permanence are not the same thing. Precision is what James Ward Packard demanded in his watches, in his cars, in the materials his engineers sourced and rejected and sourced again. Permanence is what Albert Kahn provided, not because permanence was part of the brief, but because the method that produces a genuinely sound structure produces it for a long time. One man built a company around precision, and it lasted 50 years. Another man built a factory around structural logic, and it lasted 120. They were working toward the same value with different materials. James Ward Packard died in 1928. 13 years before the factory he had made necessary built the engines that flew over Normandy. He never saw the ruin. He never saw the rave parties, or the Banksy mural, or the wrecking crews, or the December 2025 announcement. What he saw in the years he had was the factory in its first iteration, humming and producing, building the car he had been told he couldn't build, demonstrating the thing he had always believed, that a mechanism built to the right standard will perform, and that the standard is worth defending. June 25, 1956, Connor Avenue, Detroit. The last Packard came off the line. On East Grand Boulevard, the factory that Albert Kahn had built 50 years earlier stood empty for the first time in its existence. Nobody present that day could have said what it would go on to be. A ruin, a cathedral for an underground music scene, a symbol of everything that went wrong in a city and a country, a problem, and finally, slowly, deliberately, something new again. The building held what the car could not, the evidence of what had been made there, and the structure to hold something made there again. What comes next is 2029. What was already there was 1905. The gap between those two dates is the whole story. It is the right story to know.